Good afternoon. My name is David Springer, and I'm a professor and the interim dean at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT Austin. And I also serve as the director of the RGK Center for Philanthropy and Community Service, which is how I think I got tapped for serving as the moderator of this panel, which I'm really excited to do, where we will explore the relationship between philanthropy and the energy transition. This is the last panel in the Energy Institute Conference, so thank you for being here with us. Our panelists, Evan Michelson, Mary Lou Hastings, Danielle Dean Ryan, and Ashwin Dayal will be exploring the ongoing and future role of philanthropy and foundations in energy and community resilience. I'll briefly introduce each panelist. You'll hear from them directly, and then we'll have a panel discussion and save some time at the end for Q&A. I'd like to begin by introducing Evan Michelson, who is a program director at the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Evan oversees the Sloan Foundation's Energy and Environment program, which seeks to inform the societal transition toward low-carbon energy systems in the U.S. by investigating economic, environmental, technological, and distributional issues. Mary Lou Hastings is the Chief Innovation Officer at the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation in Austin. She is chair of the Austin Advisory Board of UT's Energy Institute. Danielle Dean Ryan is a climate and energy justice expert who is currently a senior advisor to the Donors of Color Network and the Lieber Foundation. Danielle served in the Department of Energy under the Obama administration and is currently a member of the National Academies of Sciences Accelerating Decarbonization Committee. And finally, Ashwin Dayal is the Senior Vice President at the Rockefeller Foundation, where he leads the foundation's Global Power and Climate Initiative, focused on scaling up renewable energy access to drive green and inclusive local development. There, he oversees a diverse range of investments in the distributed renewable energy space. Welcome, y'all. All right, let's get this started. Now that we're introduced, we'll dive into our first lead question, our prompt, where we'll go in this order. I'll first turn things over to Evan, then Mary Lou. Third will be Danielle, and Ashwin will wrap it up for us in response to this first prompt. So many philanthropic organizations have been involved in the energy transition, but sharing the unique experience that you have with your respective foundations, please share with us, with the audience, why or how your foundation decided to engage in this work. And perhaps a second part of this lead question is, how have you seen the role of your foundation change over the past decade? And how do you think the role of your respective foundations might continue to evolve? So Evan, we'll turn that one over to you first, if you don't mind.
Great. Thanks, David. Appreciate it. And hope everyone out there is doing well. And a real pleasure to be here with my colleagues from other foundations. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion and learning from them as much as anything else. So to answer your really interesting prompt and question, my take on why foundations are involved in the energy transition is that it really reflects the wide range of goals and purposes that many foundations in the U.S. have. So last time I checked, it was a few years ago now, when I looked at the numbers, there were probably about 75,000 or so philanthropies in the United States, many more globally as well. But the U.S., has 75, 80,000 or so. Many of these institutions are small, of course, and provide small amounts of grants. But even among the larger philanthropies, I'd say that there's a really wide range of approaches, tactics, strategies that reflect their individual history, mission, and culture. You have a handful of foundations represented here, and we can each talk about others as well. And the reason for these institutions being involved in the energy transition, I think, is as varied as those institutions are, right? Some of us, like us at the Sloan Foundation, focus on advancing research to address these questions and challenges. Others are more applied. Some are more US oriented. Others take a more global view. Some work on a small number of topics and issues, and others have a much broader portfolio. And I think what's interesting to think about and tease out is that even given this high degree of variation, what you have found increasingly, especially over the last few years, that there are many collaborative efforts both between foundations working on similar questions and issues related to the energy transition, And of course, collaborations between those in philanthropy and government and industry relates back to the last panel that you had. And I think that each institution is looking to have an impact at whatever scale they work on, and are working on issues related to the energy transition, in part because it's part of their mission to society to address some of the most challenging issues and problems out there, and there really isn't much more substantial than that than thinking about the energy transition. So I actually think it's really interesting and kind of welcome that the subtitle of this panel refers to the proverbial visible hand. I was thinking about this before, and I think often philanthropy is overlooked, in part because in general, the scale of the resources that we have as individual institutions and even collectively as a field is smaller than maybe the dollar amount that government and industry might be able to provide. But foundations can do a lot of things that actors in these other sectors can't do, right? And I'm sure we'll hear about this from Mary Lou, Danielle, and Ashlyn. Foundations try to be catalytic to create and initiate new efforts. We can be gap filling, right? If actors have funding from other sources, we can provide resources that fill resource gaps that they might have. Foundations, I think, have this ability to both be long-term and short-term oriented. So we can look out over the horizon and think about decadal plus challenges that we could invest resources in, or pivot quickly and make rapid changes to our grant making based upon near-term challenges. So I often like to say that foundations have almost infinite degrees of freedom to do what they want to do, as long as they account for their funding appropriately. And when you ask this question, why are they working on climate change and energy transition? I think the answer is going to be really dependent upon the work they do as institutions. So, just to wrap up, for my part, we at the Sloan Foundation largely support academic research in the social and natural sciences. That's been the mission of the Sloan Foundation since it was founded in 1934. Our energy program has given over $50 million in grants over the past 7 years or so to look at the research needs and to create the evidence base, as you mentioned, David, to inform the transition to low carbon energy systems. And I'll conclude by saying that given how intertwined these issues are, much of the work that our programs support has really been focused in recent years around interdisciplinary collaborative research teams that are both diverse and are dealing with complex social and technical challenges, and that are looking to provide the research and evidence base that can be used by decision makers in other parts of the system. So maybe I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Evan. Mary Lou, I believe we have you up next.
Sure. Thanks, David. Thanks to my Energy Institute colleagues out there for inviting the Mitchell Foundation to be represented on the panel today. Thanks, David, for moderating us. My friend and colleague, Evan Michelson, he wrote a whole book on philanthropy and clean energy technology. So I know that he has a wealth of knowledge of the entire field of philanthropy in this area, but I'm going to talk mostly about the Mitchell Foundation, the George and Cynthia Mitchell Foundation here in Austin, just down the street from UT. We do a lot of funding to UT and other higher education organizations in the state. We've been giving energy philanthropy, energy funding since 2008. We were partnered with the Energy Foundation from 2008 to 2011. So our foundation is focused strictly in Texas, which makes us unique, I think, on the panel here. And I'll get into that a little bit. Like Evan said, philanthropies lie across the spectrum, and the panel here actually is organized along that spectrum, from funding mostly or exclusively science and research to mostly or exclusively funding more advocacy for policy change or other things. I won't speak for my colleagues. The Mitchell Foundation is kind of right in the middle. We see ourselves as a bridge from knowledge to action. We seek to fund knowledge gaps or research needs that will explicitly inform either a policy question or an advocacy group so that we have what we call, or what Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner, called informed agitation. That is what we seek to provoke in society. We are a family foundation. I think we're the only family foundation here on the panel as well. So Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell founded the foundation decades ago for their own personal philanthropy, and we've grown up since then and are a strategic philanthropy with a clean energy program, a shale program, water and land conservation, and sustainability education. The climate program, or the clean energy program, is focused sort of interchangeably with climate. Our primary focus in the clean energy program is to address climate change. And again, we advocate for the state of Texas having a big role in that. We emit 15% of the carbon in the country, but we get about 1.5% of philanthropic funding. So we are always seeking funding partners for our work. And like Evan said, collaboration and co-funding is an important part of the work behind the scenes in the philanthropic sector, because you can leverage resources with partners and create more value. It amplifies the value beyond just a single dollar. We tend to look at problems from all angles. So we consider ourselves sustainability funders. So we look at social and economic impacts as well. So for instance, as an example, while we are certainly supportive of large-scale renewables in the Big Bend or the Chihuahuan Desert or in West Texas in general, where solar and wind resources are concentrated in the state, we actually prefer promoting distributed energy resources, especially solar, community solar, because it's a more resilient to storms, it creates more jobs, it's clean energy, and it doesn't have the land and water impacts that we're seeing from large-scale wind and solar in perfectly intact and rich ecosystems in the Chihuahuan Desert. I will just say that where we're seeing ourselves kind of going, since our program is 13 years old, I wouldn't say that it's changed a lot over the past 10 years to your original question, David, but the focus has remained the same over those years. But going forward, like many of us, we were caught late in the game on equity issues. What we have noticed or observed in our learning about this is that, at least in the sustainability community, the goals take equity and access to resources as a given. I mean, with consideration to those, especially intergenerational equity issues. But the means to get there, we have been caught unawares with not enough attention given to the means to the end. So the Mitchell Foundation is undertaking an internal effort right now to see how we course correct on issues of more focus on intergenerational equity, and certainly more focus on gender and racial equity and economic equity in particular. And I look forward to hearing what my other colleagues on the panel have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Marilee, so much. Danielle, let's turn it over to you.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here, and a special shout out and thank you to Varun Rai for including me, my fellow panelist on the National Academies of Sciences Decarbonization Committee. I am here with a couple of hats on, one being National Academies, the other one being the Donors of Color. And what I'm highlighting today is an intervention that is happening to get climate philanthropy to shift, because what is going on with most of the big foundations is part of the reason why we're losing. Obviously, when we think about the climate crisis, we know the oil companies have a lot to do with that. And I'll tell you a story. I spent over 10 years in philanthropy. I was at the Hewlett Foundation. I started their first serious EJ program. I was at the New Constituencies for the Environment. I worked for the Nathan Cummings Foundation, which was more progressive, and which, like Marilu, and I compliment you for the work that you're done, got caught late in the game when it came to issues of equity and started moving along to make change. And I worked within the Department of Energy at the Obama administration. And the American Petroleum Institute came to me when I was at the Joint Center, which is a Black think tank with people like Lisa Jackson on their committee on environment when it existed several years ago to scale up African-American engagement in DC policy on energy, and people like the former head of the NAACP. And the American Petroleum Institute came to me. They sent a person of color, and they said, look, you are here managing a commission to engage African Americans on energy, climate change, and the environment. And the sort of short story that they tried to sell me, this fellow African American, was, they don't care about poor people's jobs, poor people's light bills. They don't care about diversity. They're elitist, all the stereotypes about the environmental movement. And so you need to work with us, Joint Center, if you care about Black and brown people. And I said, well, I am so thrilled that you care about the poor and people of color. So let's talk about your power plants that are in neighborhoods making people sick. And let's talk about what you can do to address climate change. And that was pretty much the end of the conversation. But the reason why they had the gall to do that, and why today you're going to see headlines like in the New York Times about oil companies quoting the NAACP in places like Florida to try to get them to say that, net metering is bad or whatever, is because the environmental movement and the foundations behind them have made it easy for oil companies to get away with looking like they care about the poor and like Black people. And that's because the environmental foundations writ large have a lot of issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so the Donors of Color Network is a group of millionaires of color who got together with the folks I call the hidden figures of the environmental movement. Environmental justice advocates who have been doing amazing work, but like that movie Hidden Figures, people don't realize their contributions because of how underfunded they are by mainstream foundations. And we've launched something called the Climate Funders Justice Pledge. It's online at climate.donorsofcolor.org. And the reason why I say it's an intervention is an intervention happens when I'm going to use this analogy. You've seen someone that says they want to change, that says they know they need to change, they've tried and failed, or they don't recognize they need to change and they're harming themselves or the people around them and their friends. And I know so many of the folks that I'm engaging extremely well, and the millionaires know their fellow donors really well. Their friends come together and say, this is madness, this has to stop. And I'm going to risk losing your friendship over it. And what do I mean by this has to stop? The biggest 12 or so foundations, the latest data we have out of a report of the New School, looked at what foundations spent over the course of a year and a half. 12 big foundations, 12 of the biggest. They spent about $1 billion, and the fraction of money that went to people of color-led organizations that have a clue about justice and equity, as opposed to trying to figure it out, was 1.3%. It's a shocking number. And so the pledge says, hey, we know things have changed since then. So we'd like you to do two things. You measure what you care about, just like you measure carbon emissions. So one, share with us what's your current number from the last 2 years on what you're giving to organizations that have deep experience on justice, not who are figuring out. And I'm glad lots of people are figuring out. Those are my friends too. I know what it's like to be on the inside pushing. And then secondly, commit in the next 2 years to get to at least 30%. And so I'll end by saying our premise in sum is we are thrilled that because of so much work done by so many people of color who are underfunded in this movement, and who are the best line of defense and suffering the most when it comes to the impacts of a dirty energy industry, We're thrilled that there's now something called Justice 40 that people are bandying around. And to get to Justice 40, we need Philanthropy 30. So I'll end there as a start.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was wonderful. Ashvin, we'll turn it over to you, please.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the organizers for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually going to be the only one who uses a couple of slides, or 4 to be precise, and I think there's someone who's going to bring up the first one. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the international perspective that my work and the foundation that I work with, the Rockefeller Foundation, represents, particularly on how we as a philanthropy are looking at this whole question of the energy transition from a global development perspective. I mean, we all know that there's somewhere around 800 million people who are living without any access to electricity even. There's another 2 billion people who lack access to reliable power, and that constrains massively economic potential. So, so when we have the conversation inside an organization like ours about an energy transition, we're really looking at it through the question of what does a just and equitable transition look like globally, one that's inclusive of current and future needs. And I have this slide up just to sort of remind us that the dichotomy and the challenge we face. There's no rich country that's energy poor. There's no rich household that's energy poor. We know that providing reliable electricity is the first step for helping a community to lift itself economically and out of poverty in many contexts around the world. And yet, if we examine the data on current patterns of electrification and how energy transitions are happening, we're going to continue to worsen the climate situation. We all know that, even though there's massive progress on renewables. So the question that we've dedicated ourselves to as a philanthropy is, how do we grow access to and consumption of productive use energy to meet the aspirations of billions of people in the developing world, while also being mindful and actually advancing a low carbon future? Next slide. And we do think a low carbon future. No, we need to go back. That's it. We do think a low carbon future is plausible. So if you look at this slide that you have right now, if we think about it in terms of where we are in sort of the context of today's world, we have a traditional pattern of development in the 20th century that was largely fossil fuel based. It was coal based. We had largely centralized infrastructure, and there was the discourse, at least in the international context, in places and markets where I work, was very much about the zero sum between climate change, addressing climate change, and addressing development. We've been focused really on the whole question of distributed, green, and inclusive infrastructure. Infrastructure that is climate smart, that uses clean fuels, that's distributed and digitally enabled, and that frankly does, for the first time, give us the opportunity of looking at the global energy transition from the perspective of a sort of a potential win-win, if you like. Next slide. That's why we as a foundation actually announced a fairly substantial commitment to this. I mean, committing $1 billion over 3 years, which is just unprecedented for us, including raising additional capital from the market in order to do that, to really unleash the full potential of distributed renewable technologies. And this builds on a decade of work that we've been doing in places like India and Myanmar and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which have already sort of touched on the lives of 500,000 people and 16,000 enterprises, et cetera. And what we're talking about here, just to get a bit techie for a minute, is just, we talk about distributed renewables, we talk about mini grids of multiple scales using wind, solar, hydro, other technologies, serving individual isolated villages to large townships. We talk about productive use applications for irrigation, cold storage, mobility, value sort of processing in the agricultural sector, for example. We talk about commercial and industrial SME clusters that are currently completely dependent on diesel, where new business models can take advantage of these technologies and help spur a transition that is climate smart, but also supporting economic development. And of course, there's more and more happening with grid connected distributed storage and generation, not just in the developing world, but right here in the United States as well. So if I come to the final slide, what this slide denotes is really, in a sense, the answer to the question, like, how are we looking at the role of philanthropy? Because despite the great technological changes that we've seen that could enable a new kind of energy transition, that can look at the the application of distributed renewable technologies at a massive scale. Frankly, in the world that I'm operating in, the sector is still pretty fragmented and subscale. And so there's an amazing narrative on the promise, and then there's the reality, and there's this big sort of gap in between. And this is where, we really need to operate as a philanthropy to think about this in terms of systemic market transformations that can scale massive investments in a sector that desperately needs to grow. So what we're doing is creating a dedicated platform with using grant funding to de-risk the sector. And that includes supporting policy development, de-risking actual project development, funding technology, R&D, and also pooling sort of concessional capital into the kinds of projects and transactions that would otherwise struggle to kind of get over any kind of commercial hurdle. And just sort of thinking of three key, I guess, qualities of thinking about how, as a philanthropy, we come into this space and make a difference. Probably the most important one is aligning and supporting a multi-stakeholder, multi-partner effort. $1 billion sounds like a lot. We all know in the world of energy, it's really not much at all when you're thinking globally. How do we truly try and use grant capital to reconfigure the incentives that allow others to invest in different ways? And in this case, particularly, we're focused in on a class of development finance institutions that are really focused on the next deal and need a different kind of structure and incentive to get them to think about what is the deal that's going to be in front of them 3, 4, or 5 years from now. The second is really being highly bespoke and demand-led. If we're going to promote a just energy transition in developing markets, we have to think about the different conditions that exist and what it is the different countries need. We have a colleague actually traveling right now in Malawi, which has 11% electrification rates. The needs and the challenges there to think about how the low energy consumers of today, who are going to be high energy consumers 20 years from now, and what does that journey look like, are going to be fundamentally different from even a middle income country like the one that I'm from, India. And then thirdly, which is something that I think all the panelists know very well as working in philanthropies, is that notion of taking a patient approach. This is a 15 to 20 year mission. It's going to require institutionalizing long-term capacity. And it's only then that you're going to really unlock a self-sustaining sort of market transformation. So I'll stop there and just sort of, end with the thought that, we're living in the midst of a crisis right now with the pandemic, and for all of its strengths and weaknesses, the reason that we have something even vaguely approaching an equitable vaccine program around the world, and it's flawed for sure, is because 25 years ago, there was a vision around Gavi and creating a vaccines alliance that the Gates Foundation and others were instrumental in. And I think we have to think in exactly the same way around the energy transition, particularly as we look at it in the developing world. What is the Gavi for distributed renewable electrification? And how do we, as philanthropies, come together to create that movement? Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwin. I'm enjoying this discussion so much. We're going to shift gears a little bit, and I've got perhaps 3, maybe 4 questions that I'd like to pose to our panelists. For the audience, if you have questions throughout this next section of the panel discussion, please submit those via the Ask a Question button feature, which you can find on the top right of your screen in your browser. And we'll build in time for Q&A after our panel discussion. So to each of our panelists, let me ask you this question, if I may. You each, in your own way, alluded to rather big gaps left by government or industry that your foundations have filled and may help to continue to fill. So how can foundations such as yours provide a unique funding stability, partnerships, or structural freedoms that are essential and sustainable and powerful? Tell us just a little more of the story about how your foundations are helping to fill these gaps. And we'll just open it up.
I'll start. I think one of the best ways, unfortunately, the Mitchell Foundation doesn't do this very often, but we hear from our grantees that the most stable philanthropy that they would like to see more of is multi-year grants. we fund one year, one grantee at a time. Now, we often fund those grantees over several years, but it's only 1 year at a time. Like Ashwin said, these are all long-term problems, whether it's science, because science takes a long time, technology development takes a long time, markets take a long time to change, policy takes a long time, and they're all interrelated. So we find gaps in science or research. Often on occasion, we partner with Evan at Sloan to co-fund the filling of those gaps. That science takes a year or more to publish the results and whatnot, plus do the science. Sometimes that science, in our experience, provokes larger discussions, either in the policy community or the commercial community or marketplaces, or technology development, that then spurs on, more work. Of course, our advocates and grantees are doing that work, not us. But we see our jobs as finding gaps in some piece of knowledge or some piece of advocacy or some piece of technology or something, and then going about strategically. We have ways of thinking about these problems that we then deploy our patient capital as wisely as we possibly can, that we know to fill those gaps that then we believe will be amplified in the action of others.
Thank you, Mary Lou. Let's see if any of our other panelists would like to chime in on this one.
I mean, maybe I would just use the analogy. I don't know if you remember in the old early days of computers, we used to have the defragment function when your disk was going crazy. And I kind of see our role a little bit like that. It's not so much filling gaps, but creating the connective tissue between sectors that often are operating in silos, are not sort of intending to, or are not really structured or incentivized to cooperate. So how do you get sort of a government program that's running, and again, in my case, that's running a subsidy scheme on trying to do something in a fairly siloed way on promoting distributed renewable technologies. You've got other private capital providers who are eagerly looking for these projects, but don't really know how to interface, don't have the right policy environment in which to feel that they can come in and take advantage of those subsidies. You've got a gap in local developer capacity. So there's a need for business development support. So it's that sort of the building of that ecosystem and the defragmenting of many small efforts and trying to create something that can have a bit more momentum. And frankly, having the flexibility to fund things that there is no other taker for in the marketplace, right? That's I think where we find our real opportunity to make a difference.
Evan or Danielle, would you like to take a crack at this one, or are we ready for the next one?
I'm happy to jump in. And we are working on making sure, and in this case, I'm an advisor to a couple of foundations, like the Libra Foundation, that I'll talk about in particular right now, making sure that we try to build enough political power and generate enough public participation and organizing to make the conversations and technology things we're talking about right now actually matter. And so I'd submit, we'd be very depressed right now if we still had the last administration in power, and this discussion would be truly academic. And there's a tremendous amount of hope right now because of who sits in the White House. And that happened because there was enough power of a coalition, a minority of progressive whites and a majority of most people of color and a supermajority of Black folks that helped to win the election and the Senate to give us the ability to even think about trying to do something serious at this 11th hour. And we try to learn the lessons from the past. And if you look at what happened with the last run at climate policy under Waxman Markey, because of the same challenges around attention to equity and diversity that we talked about, many of the foundations were overfunding big mainstream green groups that were taking baby steps on diversity and thought we can get this done with an insider DC game, and it collapsed, right? And talking purely about democracy, one of the reasons why we got Trump is because he was speaking to people lots of nefarious things, of course, right? Communications, lots of other things. But there was also an underfunding of people of color in key states that were saying, we're not getting enough resources here to mobilize folks of color. And you don't win an election in the United States without adequately funding that. And you don't win on climate without adequately funding power. And so the Libra Foundation is trying to really invest in organizations that understand how to mobilize communities. For those of you that know that oil companies tried to overturn climate, the California's climate law when it was groundbreaking several years ago, I helped to fund a number of organizations working on that. They won because we had an unusual coalition come together of people like Tom Steyer that had deep pockets and folks that recognized we weren't going to get Texas oil companies coming in from out of town, that they weren't going to lose as they try to put a proposition before Californians to say the usual, these rich white folks working on climate don't care about your jobs. To undermine that argument, you needed the Black and brown folks who were saying, yeah, we have some issues with this climate law and its equity issues, but what we need is better climate law, not undermining what's here. And a lot of folks got funded on the ground to have their brilliance and strategic thinking and organizing have enough power to overcome that went down in defeat. So in short, we're trying to look at what failed in the past, what succeeded in specifically energy policy, and what succeeded in getting us to a point where we can talk about Justice 40. And may I say, the National Academy's panel, if you go to their website on decarbonization, has been briefing, we've been briefing for Congress, CEQ, all the rest of them on the recommendations. We had folks like Sloan that helped to fund that. And the key lesson coming out of there, looking at what's happening in France with the Yellow Jackets and others, is that we are overfunding on technology, we are overfunding on policy design, and we need much more attention to equity and engagement and public participation across a broader swath of the United States. So we're working on building the power to make any of these overfunded at this point technology interventions. Technology is great. We wouldn't have won the election without technology. But if you try to do just technology and all the Facebooking, whatever you would want, and all the basic science you want, and all the demonstration projects that you want, and you don't fund enough engagement and power to even get to the point where we can enact these things, then we're fooling ourselves. So we're working to build more power to change.
That's great. Thank you, Danielle. I wonder if I might pose my next question, which is if you can help us explore the role of philanthropy in supporting basic research, say across the natural and the social sciences, as it's related to energy transitions.
Maybe I'll start there, because we think a lot about the funding of research in this space at the Sloan Foundation. So I think what's important to know is that there are many areas in the climate energy philanthropy space that are underfunded. I think what Danielle said is exactly right in terms of the organizations led by people of color is a key gap. Another one is sort of the underfunding of research, particularly in the behavioral, economic, and social sciences. So there have been some studies that are published. I think you have to take all these numbers with a grain of salt, but one study found that sort of at most 4% or so of philanthropy given for climate and energy purposes goes towards research purposes. Another study found, to Danielle's point, that over the past few decades, social science research in this area got 0.12% of research philanthropic dollars. Not 12%, but 0.12%. Highly, overspent around by technology related funding. And I think that the challenge there, right, is that funding research is hard. It can be slow, right? The immediate societal relevance for this really pressing challenge can be hard to glean. Sometimes the work can seem esoteric a little bit. But I think if we're going to need the many solutions that we are going to need to develop and deploy for climate and energy problems, we need to account for the technology, the social and behavioral factors as well. We need to have a robust research enterprise. And I think that means funding work across different disciplines, across interdisciplinary studies, across different geographies, and look at different time scales. Research that might be more straightforward and conventional, some work that might be more speculative and novel, replication studies that check to make sure that original findings are accurate. And I think for a lot of the folks that are watching today, I think especially for students and newer scholars that are interested in the energy transition, you need research practitioners, I think, more so than anything, where you have individuals that are trained and conversant in multiple research methods. You see people with both technical skills and skills in the social sciences, but also have an ability to talk to policymakers, communicate their findings well, work in communities, and bridge that gap between the academic world and the practitioner and policy world. I'll just say there's an organization out there called the Science Philanthropy Alliance that we at Sloan are a part of. I think the Rockefeller Foundation is part of, and a number of other small and large foundations in the U.S. have formed to help newer funders interested in funding academic research, whether it's on energy, climate, other basic science questions, to kind of think about how to fund research, because it's a little bit different than funding work in other dimensions. And as Mary Lou said, I think the ability to create an evidence base is something foundations are very good at, that can then be marshaled for the decision and power building efforts that might be in scope for other institutions.
That's great. Thank you, Evan. Perhaps I'll pose one more question to the panelists before we open it up for Q&A from the audience. And it's based on your experience, what's the potential impact of funding collaborations across different types of funders? So here we're thinking, the private sector, nonprofits, philanthropists, government, industry. What's the role of foundations and philanthropists in doing that work?
I mean, I'm happy to start quickly. I'll just say, and I think we've seen this, or I think what Ashwin and Danielle were talking about. I think foundations have a valuable role in signaling and sort of setting the agenda for work, whether it's in terms of the for-profit sector, in terms of de-risking investment, whether it's in terms of bringing energy justice to the forefront. In our world, as a research funder, we think a lot about signaling in terms of doing open calls for proposals. Some foundations do open calls, some foundations don't. Sometimes there's a mix. Over the last few years, we've done open calls for proposals in the research community to try to signal, especially to early and mid-career researchers, the importance of guiding their research in a particular direction. So we've done calls on negative emissions in terms of the science and technology development there. We just closed a call related to energy and security and distributional equity and just transitions. And I think in each institution's own way, there's this potential to signal to the broader community, whether it's government or industry, or even to the other philanthropic actors, where a particular foundation thinks that more work needs to be done.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Evan. I've got some audience questions coming in, so perhaps we can shift gears. This first one, it looks like Ashton, it's directed to you. If you can describe the initial partnerships that have emerged following Dr. Shah's announcement of Rockefeller's $1 billion green energy initiative. What partnerships does he believe are needed?
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it's in some ways it sort of ties to the former question, right? The more general question. So this is the announcement that was made late last year, and I talked about it in my opening remarks in some senses of how we're thinking about the way in which to operationalize that. So we have an ongoing portfolio of investments and projects, both grant funded as well as PRIs, program related investments, into companies that are trying to solve these problems at scale. For example, a year and a half ago, we launched a big partnership with Tata Power in India, who have committed to sort of building up a 10,000 mini grid business, that's solar-run mini grid companies, a solar-run mini grid business to kind of address the question of reliable, clean, green energy. In terms of the partnership emerging out of this latest announcement, I mean, ironically, the sort of first thing we did was to sort of step back and think, okay, now we really, really can't blow this, right? I mean, this is a huge commitment, and we need to really think deeply about the partners that we want to build around this, not just partners who will be critical in the execution and implementation, but partners who can actually align resources to this, right? How do we turn this into an even larger effort? So a lot of our energy and what, since the question is asked specifically about Raj and what he thinks is needed, has been around actually trying to broaden the set of stakeholders that we would work with. So looking at other, how do we, this has been a huge catalyst actually to get us to talk more and collaborate more with other philanthropies, for one, who are in this space, for whom, because we were sort of somewhat fragmented and somewhat subscale, we were there was enough room for us to be doing our own things in different places. And now, with this level of commitment, we're saying, look, you can't just do this on your own. You're going to have to try and build a much more authentic sort of jointly owned platform. So philanthropies, for one. I talked a little bit about the development finance institution. So this is more in the sort of in the international side, but groups like the International Finance Corporation, the US Development Finance Corporation, the European Investment Bank, and others. These are institutions that actually will bring tens of billions of dollars of investment into green energy projects around the world, but are doing so only in the most investable sectors, which are not always getting at the questions of equity and inclusion in the transition debate. So bringing them into the fold and saying, look, how can we get a larger portion of your portfolio to be directed towards the kinds of people, communities, and places that need to benefit from energy today, but who you can, through your investment, put on a low carbon path. And then I talked about, the other key partners in this, of course, are governments. They are under, when you look at, with COP26 coming up later in the year, there's a massive tension still out there between the sort of agenda around that as far as the developing country perceives this. We still aren't beyond the climate as a zero-sum game sort of conversation here. So to answer the question, a lot of what we've been doing is constructing this platform. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes a lot of talking, a lot of time spent on calls like this, unfortunately, with in the era of Zoom, really trying to understand everyone's incentives. We have multiple fora for these conversations taking place, and our goal is really to say, we're not doing this alone. And because we're going bigger, ironically, it's even more of a reason not to go it alone. And I think that's probably been the most important ethos that's emerged since this big announcement, which is, of course, very exciting. But like I said at the start, we have a single shot really now to really get it right and set it up in the right way.
Ashvin, thank you. Your end of your remarks there provide a pretty nice segue to the next question, which is, what are the panelists' views on the magnitude and time required to see improvements to global peace, quality of life, and standard of living with a massive deployment of clean distributed power? Who wants to take a shot at that one?
Well, I'll mention it's somewhat my personal views, but I share them via the Mitchell Foundation. I question a lot, or through our programs, we are always asking, will a massive deployment of clean distributed power lead to global peace, quality of life, and increased standard of living? Hopefully it will, but there are a lot of rebuttable presumptions in the assumption that it will, that transition will be a just transition. And we hear a lot about this now in the Biden administration and in the philanthropic community, that, again, the ends, the goals are a just transition. The means to get there are not necessarily just by definition or something because it's not fossil fuel powered, but it's going to be a just transition. So if you're mining cobalt in the Congo through human exploitation and putting 12-year-old boys at risk in artisanal mines so that the Congo becomes the Saudi Arabia of cobalt, so that General Motors can meet its transition out of fossil fueled or combustion engines, is that a just transition? It's not good enough. In my view, that's not a just transition, and it's not good enough. And we can't assume that it is. We can't assume that wind power is the best possible solution to our energy problem when after 15 to 20 years, wind turbines go to Wyoming to die in a huge, massive landfill. What are the shipping costs of moving these materials around the globe, and what's the human cost of exploitation to mine some of these materials? And so I think the magnitude and time required, it has to be fast, and the effort has to be global. It has to be all hands on deck. But to us, the fundamental questions of how to ensure that it's just, I actually got into an obscene discussion with a person who said that 12-year-old Congolese boys' lives were worth risking so that Indonesian 12-year-old boys would not die from climate change risks. That's just not that can't be the answer. And so I think until we can answer that question intelligently and compassionately, this just transition and the assumption that clean distributed power can do any of those three things is a massive unknown.
Thank you, Mary Lou. I'd like
Danielle has a comment.
Thank you. Danielle, please.
I feel the angst in that question. I'm from a gorgeous island you should put on your bucket list called Trinidad and Tobago. And if you look at emissions per capita, Trinidad is top 5 or top 6, depending on what year you look at, because the population is so small compared to the amount of energy we put out. And so steel drums, which also come from Trinidad and Tobago, steel band, amazing music, it's from discarded oil drums, right? And we sing about land of oil and music. That's literally the name of a soca song. I love my calypso. And oil money paid for my education. And so the reason my mom had to just find money for uniforms and secondhand books, but could send me to the best school in the country and start me on my path to a panel like this, was because of oil money. And at a very early age, before I had words like sustainable development and environmental justice and all these things that you learn, I was trying to figure out how on earth do we get the resources we need for school and the lights and everything else without me having to walk out into a beautiful ocean and get tar on my skin, or touring the coral reefs of Tobago and watching them over 10 years turn black. So I knew this would be my life's work. And one of the things that I learned is how much of a role philanthropy can play in helping to push back against that obscene discussion that Mary Lou found herself having, which happens when there aren't either the Congolese kids or the Indonesian poor kids in the room, and where it's folks saying, hey, we're trying to save the world, and so by any means necessary, versus saying, when you have a more diverse group of folks in the room, including all the folks that do the technology and the folks that are most affected and who have ideas and are trying to save their communities in the room, trying to figure out how do we get the both and. So in short, I think as we look at that question with angst, and we've been saying we're out of time now for many years, and now the National Academies, I'm proud to say, has caught up with what the environmental justice community has been saying for 20-something years, which is we have to have the both and. The way we get that is by making sure that the process and who's making the decisions is diverse and inclusive of those that are most affected, and that wisdom comes not just from PhD, from those that are actually part of the equation, and accountability through a good democracy. So this can be solved. We can get where we need to go, but we have to change course, and philanthropy has a very big role to play in that.
Danielle, thank you. Appreciate that perspective. It's really powerful. We have a couple of minutes left, and I wonder if any of our panelists would like to share just brief concluding thoughts or parting words before we turn things back over to Varun Rai.
I mean, I would just echo a lot of what I've heard from Danielle and Mary Lou and Evan, and just say, I think the most important question that we try and grapple with around this question of quality of life and standard of living and the authenticity of the work is to stay focused on what is exactly the problem that we're trying to address here. I come from a background of having worked for 20-25 years in post-conflict reconstruction economic development programs, actually not an energy person. I was drawn to the world of energy because of the opportunity I could see in front of me around what it could do to improve the lives of tens of millions of people. The fact that it also intersects with this moment where we have this existential climate crisis, and you have this technological movement, and you have all of these different forces at play, and you look at this and think, okay, if we are really thinking deeply about the systemic change that this can bring about, then we have a chance to do something pretty remarkable. But you're absolutely right. This will not on its own solve many of the underlying problems of equity, inclusion, and justice that are really at the heart of the conversation.
Thank you, Ashman. Anything else, y'all, before we turn things back over?
I was just going to say that for those that are listening, especially those kind of interested in the foundation world, one of the powers of philanthropy is that it gives you a really bird's eye system level view of what's going on. And it really highlights the complexities that are out there that you heard about, the past hour or so. We could have gone on longer. And I think that's one of the really interesting parts about the sector. So folks, especially early career folks that are thinking about working on the energy transition, you really get a sense of the challenges and opportunities by being in a philanthropic organization.
The one thing I'd add is I went through getting degrees from Williams College, working at NASA, London School of Economics, without discussions like these. And when someone told me I should check out philanthropy, I was like, ladies, who lunch? And they're like, who do you think funds the Sierra Club? And I was like, well, I don't know. I send them $25 and I canvassed for them. And, they sent me a little, green, one more bag, right? And so especially for the students out there, the foundation sector is really powerful. A good place to get up to speed on what's happening is climate.donorsofcolor.org, about the Climate Funders Justice Pledge, climate@donorsofcolor.org. And then just wanted to end with a massive thank you to Varun for making sure that this conference was holistic in addressing all the elements that need to be changed to be able to, and that need to be addressed to make change happen, and that it can happen. It can happen.
Danielle, that's a great note to end on. Evan, Marilyn, Danielle, and Ashwin, I really want to thank you for this illuminating discussion, and more importantly, for the work that you do and the impact that you're having. In closing, I'd like to thank our panelists for their insights and everyone who is here with us at the end of the conference. Thank you for your time. And it's my pleasure to now turn it back over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Varun Rai, to close the conference.